So this panel session is racial justice and policy and advocacy. And we are joined by four lovely humans. I'm going to introduce three of them, and then one is going to introduce herself. But we are joined by Joby Thoyalil, who is here representing the Coalition on Racial Equity. We are joined by Ambassador Maulian Dana, who is representing the Wabanaki Alliance. And we are joined by Mariana Angelo and Christiana Marvray, both representing Portland Black P.O.W.E.R. So let me first introduce Joby to everyone. Joby has over a decade of experience working in both Maine and New York, advocating for economic and racial justice through policy change. He works as a senior policy advocate at Maine Equal Justice, where he analyzes and develops legislative and administrative policy proposals and coordinates policy advocacy on a range of issues related to the economic stability of low-income individuals and families in Maine. Joby currently serves as a commissioner on the newly established Permanent Commission on the Status of Racial, Indigenous, and Maine Tribal Populations, which is an independent governmental entity with the mission to examine racial disparities across all systems in Maine and to specifically work at improving the status and outcomes for historically disadvantaged racial, Indigenous, and tribal populations in the state. Prior to moving to Maine, Joby worked as a campaign organizer at the New Economy Project in New York, where he coordinated multiple campaigns and coalitions, including the statewide New Yorkers for Responsible Lending Coalition and the NYC Coalition to Stop Credit Checks in Employment. He earned his master's in public administration from New York University's Wagner School of Public Service, where he specialized in public policy analysis. Analysis is not a word. Next, I want to introduce Ambassador Maulian Dana. She is the tribal ambassador for the Penobscot Nation. She works to represent the nation and advocates for policy changes at local, state, and federal levels of government. She has an extensive background in activism and ending the use of Indian sports mascots and replacing Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day, both of which have become Maine state laws. She's the co-chair of the state's Permanent Commission on the Status of Racial, Indigenous, and Maine Tribal Populations. She's also the co-chair of the Maine Climate Council's Equity Subcommittee, the board president. She's also the board president for the Wabanaki Alliance and serves on many other boards and organizations. She is the proud mother of two daughters, and she has dogs, I just learned. Next, Christiana Marvray, who uses the pronouns they, them, theirs, is the co-director and founder of Black Portland Organizers Working to End Racism, or Portland Black P.O.W.E.R. Coming by way of a strong activist community in the Midwest and Brooklyn, Christiana has been in the organizing space working with empowering young people since 2015. They are a full-time nursing student, a plant and herbalism lover, and enjoy brainstorming how to break down the nonprofit industrial complex in their spare time. Through their work with Black P.O.W.E.R, they seek to sow community connections in order to create BIPOC spaces for healing and for change. And then I'm gonna let Mariana introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. My name is Mariana Angelo. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am also a co-director of Black P.O.W.E.R. I am a full-time student at the University of Southern Maine. I was born here and raised here. I've been organizing since I was around 16, 17. I've been in multiple different organizations. I started out with just regular school activism and kind of worked my way up of embedding myself more into the community. I also belong to the South Sudanese community here in Portland. And yeah, I think that's a good bio. I didn't pass in my bio on time, so that tells you what kind of student I am. So that's why I'm doing it.
No one else is obligated to confess anything. That was a beautiful bio, so thank you, Mariana. All right, thank you. So the way this evening is going to go, each organization is going to spend some time introducing, each person is going to spend some time introducing us all to their organizations and the work that they've been doing recently, or the origin story of their organization. And then we're going to get into some questions that we've worked together to kind of craft. We leave some minutes at the end of the session for Q&A, but I want to invite you all to drop your questions in the chat box or drop them in the Q&A box as they come up, because I may take a break from asking these questions that we've created together to ask your questions. So please feel free to drop those into either the chat box at the bottom of the screen or the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I think that's it. Andrea, thank you for dropping the information to the Portland City Council meeting there. It's in the chat box for those of you who are interested. So the goal of this series has been to just bring awareness to the work that each organization is doing, and to bring awareness to the important pressing issues at the intersection of racial justice and whatever the topic is, that would be policy this time. And then to just inspire the audience, to all the people who are in attendance, to support the highlighted organizations. And with that, I would love it if, Joby, do you want to tell us a little bit about CORE, the work that CORE is doing?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me on this panel. So I work at Maine Equal Justice, and Maine Equal Justice is part of the Maine Coalition on Racial Equity, or CORE. CORE is a really young, by young I mean new coalition that is, and it's kind of in its infant stage as far as coalitions go. We basically started talking as basically a group of policy organizations working in Augusta, all sort of overlapping. We all have different missions. Some of us, like Maine Equal Justice, were focused on improving the lives of people with the lowest income in Maine. Other members of CORE include the ACLU of Maine, which is protecting people's civil liberties. We've got Maine AFL-CIO, which is improving worker conditions through labor rights. Maine Center for Economic Policy. These are organizations that have been in Augusta doing policy work for years. It's what they do mostly, is policy work. And we've worked together on numbers of issues. Our different focuses would overlap for years now. And then a couple of years ago, really with the leadership of Representative Rachel Talbot Ross, who, as I'm sure many people in the audience know, is the only Black woman legislator in Maine. She was, I think this was maybe her first or second year as a legislator, approached some of our organizations and said, you guys aren't collaborating around racial justice. You're collaborating on these other things. You individually, some of your groups are coming before me in my committee and you're supporting racial justice bills, but can we collaborate? Can we start to strategize? And we said, definitely. And so we didn't really know what that would look like at first. But we all were definitely into the idea and wanted to maintain the spirit of the idea. So all we did at first was we just continued to talk. We started just with phone calls. It was weekly at one point, then it turned into monthly. And then we started to slowly collaborate, and we started to do a few things, like we sent a letter to the new legislature, not this current legislature, but the last legislature. We sent a letter to them to encourage them to think about the racial justice implications of constitutional officers. So that's like Maine's Attorney General, Maine's Secretary of State. This is one of the first things we did, which is why it comes to mind. We asked them, hey, think about what power the Attorney General has to impact racial inequities in our state. And then later on that year, we collaborated around a bill, and it happened to be the bill that established the Permanent Commission on the Status of Racial, Indigenous, and Tribal Populations. And that bill passed, the commission was established, and as you heard from our bios, I'm on that commission, Ambassador Dana's on that commission, and that really gave us a lot of momentum, and we decided, okay, we need to formalize this coalition. So coming into this legislative session, we decided to formalize. We are now a coalition that we're sort of more public, so we're endorsing more bills. We've decided to focus on bills because we all have very different missions, and we're focusing on different areas. Even though the legislative session, this session in particular, I've lost count. There are countless of bills that would have a positive impact on racial equity in our state. We've decided to really just focus on the bills that would change government, change the way government works, change across systems. So not just poverty issues or not just labor issues. We're talking about something like LD2, which is a bill that actually has already passed. It was the first bill that CORE prioritized this year, which would allow for legislators to ask for a racial impact statement on bills that they're reviewing as legislators. So that means they can actually try to consider, depending on how good the data is, whether or not a bill that they're going to vote on would have a positive or negative impact on race. And so this is like changing the way government functions and should impact issues across all the areas that we focus on. So that's where we're trying to put our energy and focusing as a coalition right now. That's kind of a summary. I'll just say that we're still a group of policy organizations in Augusta that are almost all white-led. And it is our intention as a coalition, when we have more resources and we have more time, when we're not in the middle of the legislative session, to increase our community engagement and to partner with BIPOC-led organizations so that we're not working in a vacuum in Augusta, that our work is more connected to right now. That connection is only happening through whatever organizing and relationships our individual organizations happen to already have. But we as a coalition, we're very uncomfortable with the fact that we have the name racial equity in our name, and yet we're a bunch of white-led organizations in Augusta. So I just want to be upfront about that. And I'll stop with that.
Thank you, Joby. Thank you. Ambassador Dana, just tell us about the Wabanaki Alliance, please.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me here tonight. I know I was one of the reasons for us postponing, so thank you for your patience. And yeah, I'm super excited to share about the Wabanaki Alliance. We are a fairly new group as well, and we were basically formed because the tribes were uniting around some key movement around tribal sovereignty in Maine. And there are 5 tribal communities in Maine. I'm from Penobscot Nation, which is kind of centrally located. There's 2 Passamaquoddy reservations in Washington County. And then in Aroostook County, there's the Holton Band of Maliseet and the Aroostook Band of Micmac. And we're all very, obviously, we're geographically spread out from one another. And we have very unique communities and histories and goals even and needs. But we have united around the need to have our tribal sovereignty fully respected and even acknowledged by the state of Maine. And a key barrier to that has been the 1980 Maine Indian Land Claims Settlement Act. And I'll try to condense this as much as I can, but essentially it was discovered in the 1970s by the Passamaquoddy tribe that about 2/3 of the state of Maine had been illegally taken from the tribes. The treaties were never ratified through the federal government. So these claims in the lawsuit were very valid, and there was a lot of commotion around settling these land claims. And it was a very tumultuous era. I wasn't alive yet, but from what I've heard, it was, there was a lot of people in Maine afraid that the tribes are going to come and forcefully take land back. There's stories about people like sitting on their porch with a gun, guarding their property. So it was a very, and then the tribes, because of these generations of trying to heal and survive after the initial colonization and the ripple effects of that attempted genocide, the tribes were living in a lot of poverty. So the tribes signed on to this agreement. They were able to get some resources, buy some land back from the federal government. And in this agreement, it went a step further from settling the land claims, and it set up some jurisdictional provisions that left the interpretation very, strongly over the years. The interpretation has been that tribes are wards of the state of Maine because of some of the language in this settlement. There is also language added that the tribes in Maine, if we signed on to this deal, weren't able to access federally beneficial legislation that other tribes in the country could access. So in these 40 years, there have been 151 laws passed that the tribes in Maine haven't had access to because of the restrictive language in this settlement. So it's a pretty complicated and thorny issue, but the thing that kind of rings true is that the tribes really need to amend the Settlement Act to fully enjoy our rights as federally recognized tribal nations. And I have family that was alive in 1980, and some of them were very opposed to this signing, said like the writing's on the wall, we're never going to be sovereign if we sign. Some were in favor of it, saying we might not ever get another deal like this. Jimmy Carter was leaving office and he was happy to sign it. Ronald Reagan was coming in and he made it known he would not sign anything that came his way about this. So I think that both of those views are very valid. And at the time, it was kind of understood that this agreement could be, we could come back to it if it wasn't working. And that's never happened in 40 years. There have been a lot of attempts to amend it and nothing has ever come to fruition. So the Wabanaki Alliance was formed as a way to support the legislation currently working through the process that is essentially amendments to that Settlement Act. And it covers a broad range of areas. And I don't think it's any secret that the relationship between the state of Maine and the Indigenous nations has been tense, has been strained. And a lot of it is because of these jurisdictional issues. The tribes are never going to stop fighting for clean air and clean water. And, point, period. Like that's it. So that's been, a point of contention. There's, the federal acts that haven't applied to the tribes. Like we were able to pass a separate law extending the federal Violence Against Women Act provisions to tribes in Maine. So we were able to get that to happen, but it took a very long time. So we would like to see tribal sovereignty fully recognized by tribes in Maine as it is all around the country. And where the bill is at right now, it is likely to be carried over into the next part of this session. It is sponsored, that's my daughter. It's sponsored by Representative Talbot Ross, and we're very happy to be collaborating with her on this, and she's a fierce and amazing leader. So we're hopeful that we can keep the momentum and the energy around these much needed changes. And I'd be happy to get into some more details as we get into the question and answer.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Mariana Christiana, tell us about Portland Black Power.
Hello, everybody. We are two of the several founders of Black Power, and we are the co-directors. As has been described, our organization stands for Black Portland organizers working to end racism. We originally started our organization under the name of Black Lives Matter Portland last summer in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. A collective of Black individuals came together in solidarity and mourning to hold space for each other. And we ended up planning a fairly large protest here in Portland. And from that space that we created, we decided to continue to this work of creating spaces for resilience and healing for Black folks within the state of Maine, specifically in Southern Maine and our city of Portland. So from that time, we have really been working with our community to see what our community really needs in terms of restoration of community trust and building with the city of Portland, with the city officials here and the infrastructure of the systems that are set up to oppress us in this city. That kind of led us to our original genesis goal was to abolish the city manager position. Here in Portland, we have a unique city government system where we have a mayor and we have a city manager, but the city manager essentially makes all of the decisions for the city. So it's very complicated. We don't have to get into the whole thing, but essentially, if you think about it, one person who is not an elected official controlling all of the budgeting and several other things that directly impact BIPOC individuals in the city, you see how that can quickly become really problematic, especially when that person is intent on increasing the police budget in the midst of a civil rights movement. So we kind of decided to take that on as our main mission. And with that, saw that Fair Elections Portland, they were trying to have the city charter be reopened so that the city of Portland, the constituents could vote on lots of different things. You can do lots of things with the city charter. You can add bus stops, you can take away districts, you can add districts. You can create more funding for schools, you can create greater allocation and defunding the police, just more accountability and transparency for constituents to be a part of their local government. And through that, Portland passed overwhelmingly referendum A last fall, which was really exciting. It opened up the city charter for people to be elected to the city charter and represent the district's needs with that. And so that was kind of our first foray into any sort of policy. And it's been a steep learning curve from there. Definitely been learning from our community members and taking heed from the organizations who have been here. As we were just commenting amongst ourselves on mute here, that, it's really nice to honestly be in a space with other organizations that are also in their infancy and to see us making waves, because I think it's really important in order to be a part of the infrastructure and also create new spaces for innovation and community. And so, yeah, that's what we've been, that was kind of our origin story. From that, Mariana and I have kind of taken on the reins of collating with Portland Public School District and working pretty closely with students and creating a community mutual aid fund, which is really great. And I'll let Mariana explain the current projects that we're working on.
Yeah, so as Christiana said, we kind of blew up very quick as far as everybody being like, who are these new organizers in Portland and what's like the work that they've been doing. But little did they know, like a lot of us have grown up in Portland, a lot of us have been in the community, a lot of us have been on the receiving end of a lot of trauma, not only from police, but just racism and how it works in Maine. And so that's why we're so invigorated in doing this work. And as Christiana said, so we've had a pretty good relationship with trying to get into the Portland Public Schools as far as trying to curate programs for them, trying to make sure that BIPOC students are being supported within the school system. I actually went through Portland Public Schools. And so it's very interesting to see the conversations about the budget, because when I was going to high school, that really wasn't a thing. Things were pretty set in stone. And I think that we are on a curve of people wanting to learn more, people wanting to do more, people wanting to understand what it really is like to be us and to look like us and to walk through this life of being in Maine, which is a predominantly white state, as we know. And a lot of the work that we've been really doing, I think we just finally called ourselves like consultants, that we finally put 2 and 2 together. Like, we've been doing this work, I think we might have graduated from organizers, maybe just a little bit.
Always organizers
at heart. And now like the work that we do, is very much centered in creating and curating very like honest and transparent and safe spaces for Black students and for Black people in general. And our mutual aid is one of those. So our mutual aid, for anybody who actually hasn't applied or knows somebody, this is for all BIPOC folks, but really for anybody. So anybody could really apply. And you do get the money directly, however you would like. So it could be Cash App, Venmo, however you would like. These funds are for the community. This isn't for us. These are like instant reparations. This is, we don't do a lot of work on the policy side as Maulian and Joby do, which is like all amazing work. Us being organizers, we have a different relationship with the community. We have a direct hand and we directly see how policies affect our community. We directly see people who aren't eating and people who don't have the structures and the resources to get the things that they need. And our mutual aid is pretty important in serving those communities that maybe aren't comfortable with going to other white organizations, but just recognize us as like friendly, common faces that they see all the time. That's really here to make sure that they are supported in whichever way that they would like.
Thank you all. Oh, it was really good to hear from all of you. And for those of you, if you want to go back and look at the session that we did on racial justice and economic justice, there's a whole, spend some time talking about the importance and significance of mutual aid as a community building tool. So, and so what Mariana and Christiana are talking about and what Black Power does fits right in. As someone who used to be closer to legislative things and is happily very much farther away from it, it was really, really good to hear from you and Ambassador Dana and Joby to hear about the things that are some of the legislative work that's happening now. So let's get into these questions. So I imagine that all these attendees here are excited to hear from you all and your organizations, because you're offering them this kind of firsthand opportunity to hear about both statewide racial justice and tribal sovereignty work, and then local racial justice and tribal sovereignty work. I'm wondering if you could take some time to talk to us about some of the policy initiatives that you've been seeing that directly affect Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. And when I say policy, I mean, I don't just mean legislative, I mean at the city council level too. I think you've already talked about it a little bit. So if you want to, talk more about those same policy initiatives, that's great. But if you want to talk more broadly speaking, that's also good. I was also curious if you could talk about or characterize some of the shifts that you've seen towards racial justice, racially just policy, or policies that that lift up tribal sovereignty, especially ones that are like coming from outside of Wabanaki communities. Do you feel like these shifts are genuine? Who's been taking the lead in some of this work? And do you feel like these shifts, this turning attention towards more racially just policies will have a real impact on the lives of Black and Brown and Indigenous Mainers? So a lot of questions there. You're welcome to just approach however you want. Let's start with Christiana and Mariana. What have you been seeing? And what is your assessment of what you've been seeing?
So directly here in Portland, we're in the middle of the charter commission race. And so just to dive a little bit deeper into that, the charter is essentially the constitution for Portland. And so in 1922, the KKK played a vital role in establishing the city manager position. They essentially wanted to create a stopgap for Black and Indigenous and people of color to have a say in their government. There was actually a thriving Black community that was pretty prolific up on the Hill in Portland, and essentially wanting to curtail the influence of BIPOC individuals and constituents in Portland. So let's create the city manager position, which strips away the power from the elected officials so that we can essentially manipulate the city government and the flow of funds and the flow of resources through this one position that is not elected. And so we have a city we have a mayor here who is essentially just a figurehead, well, I mean, like, I mean, it is, and it's unfortunate. We advocate for a strong mayor system. It is an unfortunate system that we have here in Portland. That is, we have our city councilors for each of our 5 districts. And so, like I was saying earlier, opening up the city charter so that we could abolish the city manager position was our original goal. And now we're in the middle of the city charter, or the charter commission race. And so people are running from their districts, representing their districts. And we're really kind of seeing the breakdown and the dissemination of access within this race. That's something that previous candidate from District 2, and Burnett, Shea Booley from District 1, Nazreen as well, who's at large, and Catherine, who's also running for at large. Pretty much all of the candidates who are social justicely aligned, which most of them are, thankfully, are speaking pretty openly about accessibility in running for these races. And accessibility meaning financially, you have to have the funds, to have the signs, you have to have 50 signatures.
Oh, just to get on.
I can't remember. I think it's 50 signatures if you're just running for a district. I could be wrong. Please, if there's somebody who's running for charter or somebody who's more informed, please drop it in the chat. You have to have a significantly less amount of people to sign for a district than you do have to represent all the districts at large. And that's a huge barrier. People needing to go out after they go to work, after they drop their kids off, to get signatures, getting friends to enlist signatures, spending time, weeks at a time, people not able to reach their signature amount. And that's just to get on the ballot. So we're not even getting into the finances. We're not getting into the amount of time, and that this isn't a paid position. The city is not paying these people to run. And these are things that are going to be instrumental in implementing changes that are directly going to impact Black people in Portland. We're talking about little things like winterizing sidewalks, to elder care after like work activities, to park space, to defunding the police, to access to public bathrooms, to how we're going to communicate and deal with the like horrible ways in which the city treats the unhoused population here in Portland. All of these things are going to be cornered in this charter commission. And so really wanting to make sure that people who are aligned with the correct messages and the things that are going to be opening up access and opening up those margins for people. It was incredibly difficult, I think, for a lot of people. I think there was really not a lot of momentum towards it up until this last 8 weeks or so, because the city was really pushing back on allowing this to happen. And so from our perspective, like Mariana was saying, being kind of on that level where we are our hands are in the community directly, seeing the direct impacts of the policy changes that are happening and of the things that are being up. We're going to a live city council meeting and hearing people calling in, sharing their stories about why you need to defund the police and why unhoused individuals need direct access to care and to resources that will help them survive. And we're also then meeting those people at an unhoused encampment that same day, outside of City Hall, people who are sleeping outside, demanding that the city see them because the city completely was ignoring them. And so really seeing this cycle of abuse that's happening between the city and the infrastructure within the city and the oppressed people who live here, and really trying to make sure that we're able to advocate for them. And so at this point, really just kind of, we've definitely taken a backseat, just because we're not a 501c3 and we're not a 501c4, so we can't endorse people who are running for races. So we've definitely taken a backseat and just kind of observing and seeing what support people need in terms of, what are you guys looking for? How can we align ourselves with what would best fit for what needs to happen for Black folks within Portland, and talking with candidates directly and allowing other organizations who are doing a lot of the community education around what the charter is and why it's important, and just supporting them in their work. And so I think that that's really something that struck me, is just seeing this thing that we started, kind of immediately with the protests that we had in mourning of George Floyd and lives taken from police violence last summer. This city manager goal, this direct mission that we had, and how that's kind of changed and permutated into different things. And now just seeing the ways in which we're able to directly advocate for the people who are part of these districts, so that our charter candidates can represent us on the city charter. I think that it's going to be really, really powerful this next upcoming months, and really excited to see what's going to happen. And in terms of, I think that I have a side questions. If things are genuine, I think that we will see. I think that I'm hopeful that we are at a turning point, as Mariana said. People are reaching out to us pretty much on a constant basis, asking how they can better align themselves with our stated missions for restorative justice and reparations and resilience for Black people. People are constantly asking us how they can be doing better, organizations reaching out to us, businesses reaching out to us. And it is really, really encouraging to see this push now to say that, you know, Blackness is not a single story. And I think that people are pretty attached to a single story of what Blackness and what justice for BIPOC looks like. And as we saw with the verdict of Derek Chauvin, it's not about justice, it's about accountability, and it's about reparations and giving people, like similar with Maulian and Dana, the sovereignty that they are owed, the power that they are owed, and not feeling like we are taking anything from people that we are being given back energy so that we can give that back to our community. And so I'll let Mariana speak on.
Oh no, that was great.
Thank you, Christiana. I'm so grateful that you just mentioned just accessibility in terms of running for office, because those are things that sometimes we don't think about, just in terms of like what it takes to campaign, financially, capacity, and all of those things. And so, and Mariana, when is the vote for the Charter Commission for the candidates?
We are going to pull that up right now. We're making sure that we have it. There are some forums coming up that we can let everybody know about in the meantime. So people can now request their absentee ballots. The vote is actually on June 8th. So you can request your absentee ballot now. And there are lots of forums coming up. So there was a Munjoy Hill District 1 candidate forum today. Tomorrow there's a Peaks Island at-large candidate forum. So there will be quite a few people in that one, I believe 3 or 4. Another at-large next week, and then districts 3, 4, and 5. The last week of May will be having their charter, their candidate forum, so you can see the candidates from the different commissions. And if you want any more information about this, Portland Charter on Instagram, they are the ones that are putting out a ton of information. They're a volunteer run account. They're putting together just quick infographics about the charter. So June 8th, sorry, I answered for you. It's just because I pulled them up.
Thank you. Before we go to the next panel, just a reminder, the way that the Q&A is happening is that you are welcome to drop questions into the Q&A box or into the chat. We are not asking people to come off mute and ask their questions. Ambassador Dana, so this shift and this turn towards policy that supports tribal sovereignty. I mean, I don't think it's a shift and a turn, but I'm curious if you want to tell us a little bit about who's been taking the lead, how these policies might make a real impact on the lives of Wabanaki folks here in Maine, and just anything that you can characterize over the last couple of years in terms of the policy work.
I think the biggest shift is that it's happening. And that's probably across the board for all of us, I think. And it's overwhelming sometimes, because I think a lot of our ancestors and people doing this work for so long before us were just so silenced and so oppressed, and they were doing a lot of this good work, but nobody ever heard them. You know, for Indigenous people, we were invisible in our homeland. And that's a lot of trauma to pass on through the generations. So as we kind of move about this work now, I think we're really aware that we're standing on the shoulders of so many. And I think that's why the shift feels like a long time coming, but sometimes I think it feels like, just finally, and it's so much to deal with, I think. So it's hard to characterize exactly what that shift feels like day to day, but I know that the energy is good, and these spaces we are creating are so needed, and we're all getting to define those spaces, which is incredible, and it's such an honor. It's also a lot of pressure. And something that I like seeing is the collaboration between our different communities, between the different causes, and that we're all kind of uplifting this message of equity, of fairness, of respect. I love what Mariana said about how this isn't taking anything from anybody. It's, you know, restoring things to us. And that's actually good for everyone in Maine, not just our specific communities. And I think that's a message we've been really trying to hit home around tribal sovereignty. And thinking about this question of policy and how it impacts people, and there's different levels to that. In the 129th legislature, we passed the two bills, the Indian mascot bill, we banned those in the state of Maine. We switched Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. And I think there was a fear that that would be all we would accomplish in this, you know, state government right now, that it was kind of symbolic and it wouldn't affect everybody's lives. It was just kind of a nice gesture. And I push back on that because I've been working on these two things for a very long time. And I see that the power of representation, the power of overcoming these stereotypical images. In the Indian mascot fight over the past couple of decades, a lot of people didn't know that tribes still existed in Maine. Their only concept of Indians were these mascots. So these people that had these in their schools actually thought they were tribes sometimes. So how are you going to advocate for equity and fairness for your people if people don't know you exist, or if people think you're less than human? And when it comes to Columbus Day and glorifying that genocide, when we celebrate that as a state, we're sending a message to modern day Indigenous people that we shouldn't still be here, that the genocide of our ancestors was something to be celebrated. So I like to think that we kind of set the table with those bills, and it really brought us to a place in the discussion where we're more on equal footing. My daughter is about to go into high school, and she won't have to go play a team in sports that has an Indian mascot. And that is going to, you know, foster so much healing in our communities, I think, not having to deal with those things. Now down to what's going to affect people every day. You know, how are we going to restore economic prosperity and public health and all these things? And what this specific bill amending the Settlement Act, I think that will get to a lot of those day-to-day reality in our communities type issues. Being able to access the laws passed at a federal level without having to jump through a lot of hoops will mean we can apply for FEMA funding. It means we can persecute people in our tribal courts, no matter who committed the crime or what level of the crime. You know, and that's on any piece of tribal land. So right now we might have a crime happen on a piece of tribal land, and depending on who the victim is and the nature of the crime, that might get kicked to a state court. A lot of times the courts don't quite know what to do with that if there's tribal members involved, so they get kicked out. So we have a real justice issue. So that's kind of a practical everyday. So something I'm loving is that we're starting to see how all these pieces are connected, and that we don't have to, you know, take one bite of the apple and have to put it back. I love that we're able to keep going for it. And that's something I really am enjoying about the mission of the Wabanaki Alliance, is that it's a very long-term advocacy policy, but also just real general education and communication with a lot of our neighbors in Maine as we look at these complicated issues around tribal sovereignty.
Thank you for that. First, I just need to say that those two wins that you mentioned, abolishing Indian mascots and doing away with Columbus Day and ushering in Indigenous Peoples Day, are huge, even if they're symbolic, and not just, the fight was huge, so even though it's this symbolic, does feel, it may feel a bit symbolic. I just, the little bits that I know, being in Maine for 10 years and seeing some of that fight, and being in Portland when we wanted to shift the name from Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day, just the people who, the white folks who feel like they are entitled to have their mascot, and just the anger. So those fights they're big fights. I feel like I'm learning a lot about the Settlement Act. I mean, the little bit that I know about crimes that are committed on tribal lands, and how how uneven the justice is if it's not committed by someone who lives on those lands. It's just abhorrent. So that is very exciting work. Very exciting work. Joby, last but not least, what are some of the shifts you've been seeing? Can you characterize them? Who's been taking the lead?
Yeah. Been seeing huge shifts in Augusta in the State House. So my view is somewhat tunnel vision, because there's just so much to keep sort of pace with in the State House. And even though it's virtual now, it's now, you know, on our computer screens, but it's the same. In fact, it feels even harder to keep pace right now. But I've seen huge shifts in that realm. And I was just remembering how a few years ago, I've been doing this work in Maine for 6 years, and I don't know if it was 6 years ago, 5 years ago, but I think it was actually more recently. I think maybe like even 3 or 4 years ago, I would be giving testimony in front of a legislative committee, and would actually be told by the chair of the committee that we cannot say the word race in our testimony. We will not be talking about race in this hearing, because that was not allowed. It's too charged. And here we are now, fast forward to 2021, and we have no less than 200 bills that are seeking to somehow improve. Well, I should say too, explicitly, it's a lot less than that, but we are seeing bills that are explicitly seeking to increase racial equity, reduce disparities based on race. And this, like that alone is a major shift. You know, you go from can't even talk about it, too scared to talk about it, or you don't even believe it's a problem, and so why would we talk about it, to now there's a lot of energy amongst legislators to actually propose policies that are intended to eliminate racial disparities. And on a more sort of nuanced level, especially if you're a policy nerd and you're looking at these bills, you can see that one message that has really been absorbed by more and more legislators is that policies can't be race neutral. If they're race neutral, nothing's going to change. You know, you can have a good bill, and I will say for Maine Equal Justice, it's an organization it's been the privilege of my life to work at Maine Equal Justice. But for years, we thought that if we're going to do something to help poor people, that's good enough for racial justice, because it's going to disproportionately help BIPOC people, because you know they experience aspects of poverty at a greater rate than other people. And so in our minds, intellectually, we were like, oh, that is helping with increased racial justice. But thankfully, as an organization, we realize that's not the case, and more people are realizing that, because if it's race neutral, the disparities we see right now, maybe things get better for everyone because this bill passed, but those disparities stay the same. I mean, the data bears that out. You look year after year after year, the racial disparities in like child poverty, let's say, doesn't change. It just stays horrible. And so I'm seeing more and more bills that have something about that bill that is trying to target the racial disparity. It's saying we need to invest more in communities. The term that we're seeing in some bills a lot is the same term that's used in the title of the commission, which is invest more in racial, indigenous, and tribal populations, or invest more in historically disadvantaged populations. There's like different ways where creative ways. I'm really impressed by the efforts legislators are making in trying to target disparities. And I did want to say that I'm seeing it from a lot of different legislators. There are leaders. Representative Talbot Ross by far is, not only is she the leader in this realm, but I see her colleagues are really taking her lead, and they did elect her to leadership this year, so that's another sign of them really taking her lead. But the energy I'm feeling feels genuine in that. I see it in people showing up. For example, I've been on a couple of conversations now talking about CORE or talking about the Permanent Commission. I always see legislators in the audience. They ask questions, they follow up, they ask me and other members of CORE if we can look at their bills, how can we make it better? Along the same lines, the Permanent Commission, we put out a report last summer where we highlighted 46 bills, and I'm seeing a lot of those bills have been reintroduced, and they've been reintroduced in a way that's stronger than it was before. And the way they change their bills, in some cases, I'm like, oh, they read our report, and they're actually like making the change to better target racial disparities. I think I could go on and on. The support for LD2, the bill I mentioned at the beginning, to measure the racial impact of bills, that bill, it was LD2. There are in the end there are going to be well over 2,000 LDs, but they decided to make it number 2 because LD1 had to do with it was related to our healthcare system. And it was a reference to the COVID-19 pandemic we were in. And LD2 is a reference to the other pandemic, which is the pandemic of racial injustice. And just the fact that they decided to do that, the leadership caucus, the Democratic caucuses in the House and Senate, I think speaks loudly. And last thing I'll say is that this didn't happen spontaneously. This happened because of the brutal murder of George Floyd, the organizing that happened around the world, but very much also in Portland. I mean, I went to the protests that you folks put together, and I've been going to protests for about 20 years. That was the most powerful protest I've been to in person. So much props to you. I'm like, actually, I'm embarrassed that I'm able to say it to you in person in front of all these people, but yeah, incredible work you all are doing. And that is what has created the energy that we are feeling in Augusta now. It's amazing. It's a sea change. Will it last? We'll see. I hope it does.
Well, I say this all the time. People who know me know I am not an optimist, but I will celebrate what is happening right now. I'm not an optimist, but Joby, I did not know that there could be some sort of intentionality behind numbering the LDs. I thought it was just like, okay, this number. So thank you. I'm going to swerve just for a second, and there are a couple of questions that are coming in that I think are great questions. So let's ask those questions. So Ambassador Dana, Gail, and the Farnsworth, which I'm assuming is not the museum, welcome back Farnsworth, are both asking what's going on with the bills, why are they being tabled for the next session? Are there advantages, disadvantages? And some of that is probably just about like, just here's what the legislative session is like. And what are the major factors that are slowing down the legislation that will restore the sovereignty of the tribes? And so you want to just respond to that?
Absolutely. So the first kind of version of the amendments to the Settlement Act was LD 2094 in the 129th legislature. And that bill passed out of the Judiciary Committee, and that was over Zoom over the summer. And then the legislature never reconvened for our special session, so that bill died. So LD 1626 is essentially that bill. What we did differently was we took out tribal gaming. And I should back up a little bit. So the amendments to the Settlement Act that are in this bill are the product of a task force that was convened by the state, and it comprised of state lawmakers and the tribal chiefs. And that body came up with 22 recommendations to amend the Settlement Act. And that's what this bill is. So they voted to essentially authorize tribal gaming in Maine as regulated by the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, like any other federally recognized tribe would be able to do. And we've taken that portion out, and that's its own bill, and that's LD 554, sponsored by Representative Ben Collings. And that is still working through the process. That will not be carried over. LD 1626, sponsored by Rep. Talbot Ross, is the rest of those recommendations, essentially. And, I don't have a great answer as to why it's carried over. I have kind of a lot of little things. It came out of the revisor's office very late, and it will likely need amendment language, and that will come about with tribal attorneys working with the Attorney General's office. And there was just some concern that language wouldn't be tight enough to do all the committee work needed as the session, as this year the session is winding down. So that's part of it. And I think it's a little bit frustrating because we did have a lot of great momentum. We have a huge base that we are building of supporters and a lot of different organizations. So on the flip side, I think in politics, sometimes time can be on your side. So we can space out some events through the summer and fall and really gear up for January when we are, back looking at this bill again. And, there is some resistance that, that will give us time to work on. I think in Maine, the Settlement Act has been the law of the land for so long when it comes to dealing with tribes that a lot of people are afraid of life beyond it. And I think when the tribes bring things forward, sometimes it's automatically seen like we're fighting. And what we're really trying to do is see the unity and the peace beyond the fighting. And for us, that can only happen if we amend the Settlement Act and really restore sovereignty. And, it's tricky that we'll have to wait a little while, but we've built up so much great support right now that I'm really, I have a lot of good faith that will carry us through.
Thank you. Mariana and Christiana, my friend Regina Rooney asks, says that she knows some other communities in Maine with the similar structure, the mayor and the city manager. Do you know if the history behind the position in Portland is similar to the history in other communities? Do you have any?
We do not know. So as we learned, I am not from Portland. And so I learned a lot of this on the go with one of our members who is very involved in the political structure of Maine and specifically in Portland. So was definitely learning on the fly. I do not know if they are connected. I would imagine though, because this did happen in 1922 whenever the position was created, and Portland is such a large city. I would not be surprised if other cities were modeling their structure based on the structure that was set up here. That's purely speculation, but just knowing the way that, adjacent small city governments are set up, that wouldn't surprise me at all. Specifically because the mission of that was to disenfranchise Black and Indigenous people. So as we have learned from our just history taking in Maine, there was a large Black population here that is largely exited prior to the population of East African and West African immigrants and migrants coming here starting in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, the large populations coming over to settle over here. And so that's kind of it. There was a huge gap of time essentially where there wasn't a huge influence of Black people here and Black people were being actively driven out. specifically when you think about like the areas like up in Rumford and China, Maine, up in Milo, Maine, up in just kind of the more northern mid-coast, above the mid-coast area. So I would not be surprised at all if those infrastructures were based on this one.
Thank you. Okay, let's shift just a little bit, sort of. The next question is just about the connection between the policy work that's happening and then the folks who are just living their lives. So I sometimes feel like these political or policymaking conversations that happen both at the state and the local level aren't always accessible to the people that the policies will impact. What are some barriers that you see or that you know of that currently exist to make it difficult for Black, Brown, Indigenous people or other people of color to be active participants in these decision-making conversations? Joby.
Yeah, I think legislative processes across the country are generally not accessible. And Maine has some interesting idiosyncrasies that are both good and bad. Coming from New York, I could tell you there's actually a lot more access in Maine to your elected officials. And the fact that every single bill that's introduced gets a public hearing is, I think, pretty unique. That's an opportunity, that is an opportunity for the public to speak and the public to be heard, at least by the committee that is hearing a bill. Those are the good things about Maine's process. The bad things, which are probably similar everywhere in the country, except maybe a little bit worse in Maine, in that because every bill is heard, the process the pace is grueling. I mean, bills there are usually about 2,000 bills in a session, or at least within a 2-year session. And they have to move through the process very quickly. And unless you have a lot of resources, like you, like me, work full time to watch these bills and know how to do it, it's not the most accessible system, or there's or an organized structure around particular bills that can get the word out to your community. It's not easy to follow, and it's not easy to keep up with. And unless there's those kind of structures, also like boiling down the legalese into how something can be understood by everyday people, that stuff is not built in. That takes resources. That takes either groups like mine or other types of well-resourced, well-organized groups to do that work. And so it's just not accessible. And I think the way that particularly addresses your question, Samaa, is that when you think of the infrastructure that exists in this state for nonprofit organizations, like white-led nonprofit organizations, or business groups and trade organizations that have lobbyists, these aren't institutions of color. The communities of color in Maine have been underinvested in from the beginning, throughout Maine's history. And so part of the work to reduce racial disparities, to increase racial equity, is to now overinvest in those communities and to build up these structures so that there can be well-funded, well-resourced organizations that are doing the work of making the connections between people on the ground and the legal policy work in Augusta. And I'll just say one last thing, that has to work both ways. And this doesn't work as well as it should almost ever, that it shouldn't just be people telling you what's happening in Augusta. I think the bill making process should be informed by people on the ground. And, that happens to a certain extent, but I think that could happen a lot more, and it should happen a lot more.
Thank you, Joby. Mariana Christiana, what are some barriers?
Just as Joby has described, but obviously for us, it would be more as organizers who were on the ground. I mean, history has shown time and time again throughout history how BIPOC folks are actually being not being prioritized when these bills are being made, and they're not really understanding exactly where these bills are coming from or how they're made up or where to look this information up. Even me being like first generation, I'm the only person in my family that was born in the US. So it is very difficult for me to understand a lot of these policies that are being made, although English is my first language. And then having a family who has no connection to the US, but wanting to be invested into policies and the work that's actually being done here, and wanting to vote and wanting to put their voices out there, but not having a place to put it and not having a space to actually understand what this information is and how it actually will affect us, not just in a year, but in the next 5 years and what that actually looks like. And me and Christiana talk about this all the time, even with our mutual aid. Our biggest thing is accessibility, right? Like, how do we have these conversations and how do we make sure that this language is direct and make sure that people really understand exactly what they're getting themselves into. And I think that's the best part of being grassroots organizers, is I guess that we can actually reach our community where it is raw and authentic and they actually understand what this is actually going to look like for them and what it's modeled like. And I know for me, I'm 25 now, and it took me up until I was 23 to actually understand what is actually going on with city council, what's going on with the state, what goes on in our community. I mean, me and Samaa talk about this all the time. I was like, what bill? When did that come out? What session? And like me still being confused. And I think that it's set up that way. It's done like that intentionally. It's for us who we feel like we've done a lot of this work, and for us to not really understand exactly like what sessions are being passed, it's done like that for a purpose. And yeah, so I think the biggest thing I would always say is just a lot of it's like a language barrier, especially for me, not really understanding exactly what some of the words are. I mean, we have people give us proposals all the time, and it'll take us weeks to actually go through it, understand the terminology, the words being written, us contacting other people and being like, what does this mean? And how do we understand these very important documents that really will affect us? So I think I'd probably say that'd probably be the biggest thing.
Yeah, and it starts at the top, like it's the city website, it's not complicated. It's not like, it's not even, people don't know what bills are coming out. People don't know what sessions are happening with city council because the website's not accessible. And then if you try and go back and watch the city council meeting, it's not captioned and there isn't any transcript for it, and they're not posting the meetings, and it's not clear on when things are starting and when things are ending, and is there going to be a session that's for public comment? And then if there is public comment, sometimes they're only taking public comment on certain things, which coincidentally is not the thing that people really want to talk about, which they know going into the meeting whenever they make these things by design. So it's just, and like I have a friend who is really into accessibility around tech, and thinking about how that even goes into the infrastructure of Maine, and how Maine intentionally, I don't want to misrepresent what is actually happening with the infrastructure, basically like the internet in Maine, but that the city government is intentionally choosing systems that, like, for lack of a better explanation, the government is essentially choosing to sign contracts with companies that are suppressing the access on these sites, where they could be partnering. I believe there was a Maine run partnership that was trying to partner with the city or with the state of Maine in order to essentially update the websites, like the DHHS and accessibility websites. And it went the other way, and they decided to go with a federally run organization for that. So it's like, it's down to like, people don't even know where to click to find the information. And so when we're thinking about accessibility, it's not just that, I think it's amazing, like being from New York myself, Joby, it's so interesting hearing like, wow, we do have public comment for all of these, for all of the bills. And then it's like people who do seem to care either get fatigued, or they bypass bystander effect. That doesn't affect me. I don't need to call in for this one. Or it's just not reaching the people in general. So there's this huge divide, and trying to figure out how do we bridge that divide so that people are able to see this is what's happening on this end. These are the resources that I need in the middle in order to be able to take advantage of using my voice to either participate in this system or say, this system isn't working for me, how can we change that? And so I think it's really important to, speak to just the fact that accessibility is, that is the precipice of all of these issues. If you do not tackle the issue of accessibility, you are not going to be able to get to literally anything else. And so I think that Portland is at a very, very close turning stone right now where people are really starting to realize that, and normal people are getting involved in the city government and, going on these committees. But like Samaa, I also am not the most optimistic when it comes to those things. It's like you wish for the best and you want people to be showing up with their best foot forward. But first and foremost, you have to get people to understand that people don't know what's going on. And that, I think, in and of itself, people are like, what do you mean people don't know what's going on? And then they list all of these resources, and it's like, well, how are you getting those resources to the people? Even us, being like, we can't just be on Instagram. We need to have printed things. We need to have things that are translated. We need to be reaching out to local organizations that work with BIPOC. We need to be working directly with social workers to make sure that people know about the things that are happening that directly impact them. So I think that accessibility is everything.
Thank you. Ambassador Dana, did you have anything you wanted to add to what's already been said? Yeah.
Some really great points. I would echo everything that everyone said. And I think for tribal people, there's this, the relationship has been so adversarial that when we go to Augusta to do things, sometimes there's a tendency to, oh, they're back, what do they want? They just, they just want to come in here demanding. So I think that that's, we've come a long way around that in a short time, but that's definitely there with some lawmakers. And I would echo everything about accessibility. And I think a big problem at a federal level is how much money is involved in politics and making things happen. How do you expect marginalized groups with a history of nobody really caring about them to have a voice when we don't have access to these huge pots of resources and money to be a player in that large game? So, and certainly in Maine, looking at the government and then the cabinet and things, there's so little representation of the historically marginalized communities in Maine in high levels of government. So I think that there's a push to kind of do better around that. And the Permanent Commission, I think, has been a great tool towards that end. And when resources come into the state, let's get them into the hands of community organizations on the ground doing this work. And that's a new idea, I think, for a lot of people in government, when it used to just be like, we have these funds for these communities, let's put everything in silos and check boxes instead of thinking about the lived experience of people in those communities.
Oh, I really like that last, what you just, yes, that's so important. That's so important. Thank you. Wait, checking to see what kind of questions we have here. Again, if you have questions, please drop them into the chat or in the Q&A. One more question for me, and then we'll go to these couple of questions. I'm gonna jump down to this, the wishful, the hopeful question maybe, or the wishful kind of question. So what, if anything, do you wish that policymakers at both the state and the local level could understand about racial justice or racial equity, anti-racist policymaking, or tribal sovereignty? What do you wish that policymakers could understand? Let's go with Mariana and Christiana. Start.
Sorry, can you repeat the question? I'm bad at listening and formulating at the same time.
I wish that policymakers at both the state and local level would understand about racial justice or racial equity, anti-racist policy making.
What you wish they would understand.
Oh, sorry, I mean, it cut out at the beginning. I think that what I wish, fill in the blank, that is that people, there are real people on the receiving ends of these things. And that was something that was especially contentious last year whenever we were in conversations with our local city councilors and the mayor. We're in these meetings and everything's conciliatory, but like I said earlier, it's like we are in the streets with people during the day, and those people are calling in to the city council meetings feeling like they have to express their trauma and display it for people in order to see them, in order for the city government to see that they are actual people, re-traumatizing themselves and going through that process again in order to draw validity to their situation that yes, some people need to sleep outside because we don't have any other resources. Something so simple, and to have the conciliatory professionalism, respectability politics be played out whenever there are real people on the receiving ends of that is really, really harmful, I think, and it does nothing for restoring trust and respect within these communities. And the number one thing I think that all politicians, any person that's running for city government, elected positions in general, any position where you are making decisions that are going to directly impact another person's life, you need to be on the ground with that community at least once, just once, as a treat, as a taste, just try it, just see the communities that you are actually making the decisions for and actually be a part of what's happening on the ground. Get in contact with the organizers that are doing it, get in contact with the social workers at the local resource centers, see what's happening and see what you're actually voting on. I think that, again, with the fatigue, like that happens on the other end as well. Policymakers and people who are in elected positions also get fatigued. There's so much stuff coming at you, and being able to slow that process down, however it may be, by creating intentions around the work that you're doing and the votes that you're casting. That's my number one wish for all elected people and people who are making decisions for others.
I like that. Be on the ground at least once. I would probably say to understand that people are power. I know we say that like very loosely, like I feel like people say that all the time, but to like really understand like the impact of that people are power and people are revolutions, that we create the revolution, the people that are on the ground, the people that are pretty much first responders as far as feeling the brunt force and the impact of the trauma head on and the brutalization head on, in order for these conversations to get to a point where policies do need to be changed, and that mobilizing is really our only way to get what we need, and mobilizing from state officials, local officials to organizers. I think that is exactly what we need in order for us to create some sort of sustainable change, because young folks are really out here and they are doing amazing work that constantly goes unnoticed, and people are putting their lives on the line. And there are many, many, many activists that have not made it till today and are still being murdered and their voices are constantly being snuffed out, but they are the revolution. They're giving us the battery in our back for us to do what we do. And for policymakers to understand that as much as we love that you guys are doing what you're doing and creating these conversations, that we are on the other end dying in order for this conversation to be had. So I guess just to understand that people are revolutions and that we are really in this work, and we need to mobilize in whatever capacity that we can in order to create change.
Thank you. Ambassador Dana, what do you wish policy makers would understand about tribal sovereignty and about policy making in favor of tribal sovereignty?
I think I would love for all lawmakers to get a real education on not just the history, but the lived experience, again, I'll go back to that, of the Wabanaki people in Maine today, and to not fear the truth about our communities and our individual and shared histories and realities as Mainers all together, but to embrace it even when it's uncomfortable, and not get defensive, but think about how we can all walk forward together. And that doesn't mean that we are taking anything. I think we can get locked into an attitude of scarcity sometimes, like there's only so much to go around. If we can really open ourselves up to abundance in the work of this fairness question around tribal sovereignty and get over a lot of that fear, I think there's a lot of good things for everyone that can come from that.
Thank you. Joby, what do you wish?
I guess the idea that prioritizing solutions that target racial injustice, it's to do so, it needs to happen because first and foremost, it's a matter of justice. It's the right thing to do. It's a matter of fairness. But secondly, the solutions that, there are a lot of great bills and they're really appreciated, but I think the best solutions will always come from when their work is being done in partnership with those who are impacted. And that's where I think of the bill that Ambassador Dana was talking about earlier, the big amendments to the Indian Claim Settlement Act. That was a bill that came out of this task force that had representation from the tribes. And that's why that bill has so much meaning. It had representation from the people who are impacted, and the most powerful solutions will always be created in that way. It'll come from the people who are impacted. So I'd like to see more of that going forward. And then lastly, I'll just say, Ambassador Dana already said this, but it's not a zero-sum game. Like, justice for some doesn't mean injustice for others. In fact, it's the opposite. When we have a more racially just and more equity in our state, it's going to be good for the whole state. It'll help our economy if that's what you care about, but it'll be good for the whole state in a lot of ways. And that aspect works both ways. If you look at a lot of the problems that we see, especially with poverty and economic injustice, you can learn the history of why do we have such horrible worker conditions in certain industries, and lo and behold, they often have a root in racist, overtly racist policies that were made in this country and this state, and now it's hurting everyone. So in order to reverse that, we need to undo the racial disparities in order to help everyone. I think there's a lot of education that could be done, and when that clicks for people, for more and more people, it'll become a priority for more and more legislators, but also their constituents, regardless of what their race is.
Thank you. Joby, stay off mute. Can you respond to this very quick question before we have our very last question? Farnsworth wants to know, do you think the hearings, for you, Joby, do you think the having hearings on Zoom has increased the access to the legislative process? Can you offer just a quick response to that?
Yes and no. I think it has for a lot of people, but for the most vulnerable, least access to resources, it has made it harder.
Yep, that's the truth. All right, so we're going to go to this last question by Dan, which is a really great question. And as we go to the question, that's going to be like the responses that play us out. Just imagine that, as everyone is saying, imagine the beautiful music that's playing and their words are coming on the screen. And that is your opportunity for the next, however long everyone is talking, to drop your gratitudes into the chat, like as Jonathan Sarbeck has done so lovely, and Gloria has done, and Mary Finn has done. So please drop your gratitudes, particularly keeping in mind that we are in the middle of the legislative session, which is just intense, and folks are and we're at the end of the school semester, which is also intense, and folks are taking their time out. So please drop your gratitudes in the chat for these brilliant panelists. So Dan asks, this is Dan's question, which I think is really a lovely way to end. Dan says, speaking of the peace beyond the fighting, as Ambassador Dana has phrased it, could each panelist describe their vision of success? Imagine it's 2040 and you've achieved all your goals. What does life in Maine look like then? And let's start with you, Ambassador Dana, since you were quoted. Let's start with you.
How old will I be in 2040? I don't do math. I'll be old. Yeah, I think, if all of us on this panel accomplish everything we want to do, I think that our children and grandchildren will just have so many more opportunities than we had. I think, you know, there'll be access to employment and healthcare and just everything that our communities are really struggling for. And if a pandemic hit in 2040, we wouldn't see just the shocking disparities. It would be everybody coming together to help uplift everyone and keep everyone healthy, instead of, you know, seeing kind of the shocking rates of it affecting the vulnerable people worst. I think in a perfect world, there are no vulnerable people.
Mariana Christiana, 2040, what's up?
2040, I would love for this organization to not exist. I would love for the Community Mutual Aid Fund that we have incredibly raised $30,000 for and are continuously distributing funds to be ever flowing, for people to be able to request funds whenever they need them. No barriers, access to mutual aid. Community health is community healing. And I would love for this organization to no longer exist because we will have met our goals. And those goals tie directly into the sovereignty of the Indigenous communities in Portland and in Maine. And that would be beautiful. What about you?
I'll probably be tired as hell. If we accomplish everything, I'm gonna be exhausted.
Retired.
Yeah, definitely. I would probably say same thing as Christiana, probably have Black Power not be the entity that it is now. I would low-key want to be like those little elders like in Maine that, you know, the kids go to, like, what do I do? I feel like that's already
you.
That's already me. But when I'm there, then I'll definitely have like the catalog to back it up. But I think peaceful. I think I that's really all I strive for, is just to have like mental and emotional peace. And if we do the things that we need to do and put in the necessary work, I think we could do that.
Okay. I hate to break it to you, but in 2040, you will, well, I don't know where elder starts, at what age, but.
Mariana's still a youth legally.
I'm legally still youth, but
Legally.
I'm going over, I'm crossing over.
You'd be like my age in 2040. And well, I don't know, maybe I'm an elder. I do kind of feel like.
Are you?
What is your vision, and what's your vision of success? What would 2040 look like for you?
So I'm gonna copy Christiana's because I had the same one, which is that Maine equal justice wouldn't need to exist, because access to the systems that run our society won't be based on your wealth. It won't be based on your resources. Yeah, that'll be another good thing. So no poverty, and you don't need to be from a special class of economic or race in order to hold the power in our society.
That is beautiful. I'm answering a question right now. Yes. I love all those responses. I love that question. Thank you very much. If you're a Portland resident, please go check out the Portland City Council meeting where they are discussing the school budget. Thank you, Joby. Thank you, Mariana Christiana. Thank you, Ambassador Dana. I appreciate all of you. That's it, folks. And this series is all wrapped. It's all wrapped and bowed. Thank you very much. Folks, enjoy your Monday night. And this will be recorded. And so I know that there was someone who had to leave early and wanted to see a recording. Yes, it will be recorded. Maine Initiative sends out a really great summary sort of email with they pull out the most perfect, beautiful quotes from the panelists, and they include them in that email, and they include the recording. If you want to learn more about the organizations, please visit the websites, the Instagram. You can also visit Maine Initiatives to learn about these organizations and the other organizations doing racial justice work that Maine Initiative funds. Thank you all.